So you probably know who I am. I'm Zadek, and I really like experimenting with web technologies and just technologies in general. So I wanted to create this kind of short series where I talk about different technologies or techniques that I'm really excited about. And the one that I want to lead with is render.com. So if you've ever deployed to the cloud, you probably know that it's a lot easier said than done. And I guess one of the reasons is that there's been so much hype about serverless, but servers, I think, have been sort of left in the past. And so serverless and servers are basically they're essentially two different architectures to deploy whatever it is that you're working on. And so even though serverless is all the rage these days, realistically, you really just want to deploy a server and be done with it. So just quickly to sort of explain the difference, at least my understanding of the difference between servers and serverless. Serverless basically means that you essentially write a function, and then that function can get deployed any way that the provider wants to. This turns out to be really cool because you can just write functions and then deploy them to the cloud. The thing is, these are sort of essentially little processes, and they can be anywhere from like a few seconds to maybe a few minutes, depending on the provider. And I guess for me as a developer, it's a lot easier to reason about pure servers, right? A server is just a process in the cloud that is on as long as it needs to be. So I think the mental model of servers is actually easier than serverless. And I wouldn't, if you don't really understand the differences, I wouldn't bother with serverless at the beginning. Personally, that's my recommendation. I think you need to understand how servers in the cloud work, how do you deploy to them, and sort of, I would say, exhaust that option before you start looking into serverless, because there's a lot of confusion and a lot of hype around serverless technologies, and I think it's not the best way to start. So anyway, I want to show you render.com because this is probably one of the most profound services that I found when looking around. Right, you can use GCP, which is Google Cloud Platform. You can use AWS. You can use DigitalOcean. But I really like what render.com has done so far. And so I want to sort of highlight how it is that you can go about deploying a web app and what it actually looks like to do that. So I've already created an account, and if you want to get started, they have a free trial, and I believe that gives you access to two services. So you can use this realistically. I mean, you do have to sign up to do authentication, but besides that, it's pretty easy to get started. So I'm going to log into the dashboard, and you can see I've just got two little services. Essentially, what you can do is deploy any of these kinds of services. So you can deploy a static site. That's basically like Netlify or Vercel. You can deploy a web service, private service, etc., etc. So let's ignore database for a moment and just talk about these, because it's a little bit confusing. What's the difference between a web service? What's the difference between a private service, background worker, and cron job? So they do have descriptions, and you can look at the learn more. I was a little bit confused about the differences personally, but I guess the way that I would say is a web service is basically like an API, or it's a backend that has a publicly accessible port. So if you're developing a API that's accessible on like port 8000 and you need to be able to consume your web app on some URL in the future, that would be basically a web service. It's a publicly accessible service on the web. They do all the certificates, all the HTTPS, SSL. So that's really great. Private services and background workers are a little bit different. I may leave it up to you as an exercise to sort of figure out how these work, but what I'll say is so far I've only experienced web services and background workers, so I'll only speak to those two. And of course you can do a database. This is a Postgres instance set up in the cloud for you, and you can use that if you need to. So I wanted to show this little service that I created a moment ago. Let's see. So I'm going to open up, oops, didn't mean to push. Okay, so here is this little idea that I had. So I'm kind of the person who likes to build things from scratch, which you could say is just re-engineering, but I really like understanding what's going on. So I wanted to figure out, okay, well, what does it feel like to, how do you write like an Express server from scratch, right? So I'm used to Go, the Go programming language, and I really like this API where you just add handlers and then you listen on some port. And so this is essentially what I wanted to put in the cloud. You can just ignore these little middlewares. I just want to have this little app. It has path A, path B. For kicks, why don't we just have a regex path? Maybe it's a bad idea, I don't know. But the point is that we can designate We want our API or our server to handle these ports, and then they do these little responses. And then when we're done, we're going to go ahead and serve it on port 8000, and that's basically the whole application. So this is not a complicated idea, right? You could use this with Koa, Polka, Express, any of them. I just wanted to figure out how do you do it from scratch. So the implementation is a little bit hard to understand just because it's in TypeScript. I promise it's really not a complicated idea. It's just the TypeScript kind of makes it look a little bit muddled. But anyway, so let's go ahead and assume this works. And so first, let's look at the build process. So I'm using sbuild for this, and you may not know what sbuild is. Evan, who's the creator, he basically says it's like a linker for the web, and I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. Basically, if you have some code written in TypeScript or JavaScript XML, JSX, and you need to be able to deploy it, so you can do, node and then the name of your service, how do you do that, right? You have transpilation, Babel, TypeScript, type checking. It's kind of a mess. And so sbuild sort of abstracts this whole process away from you, which is really, it's a fantastic tool because of this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to call my node modules, which has a little .bin, and then it has sbuild. So I'm going to call sbuild. I'm going to call the name of my program, which is the entry point, main.ts. I'm going to set the flag to bundle, and I'm going to set the output file to main, and then this is just a pattern that I've developed. I just add .sbuild. It's like a build artifact. I know that I can delete it, and it's also going to be regenerated in the future. I'm going to set the platform to node. And this is important because I believe I'm using Node APIs. Yeah, I'm using, if I look at the source code, I'm using, not in this one, but over here, here, I'm using HTTP. So this is not a dependency I can use, if I were to just deploy this, as like purely as like a web app. Well, my point is I need to have sbuild know that this is using Node behind the scenes. And so that's all I need to do to make that happen. So basically, to get this to build, what I need to do is simply call make. That's going to go ahead and invoke my make file, which only has one command, and that's going to do the thing that we talked about. And that's going to generate this main.sbuild.js file. And now this is actually a program that I can run by calling node, right? So if I call node on main.sbuild.js, there's my server. Cool. So what I really want to do is, don't worry about that. That's because I have another server in the background. What I really want to do is deploy this to render.com, right? Because I have this thing, I want to put it on the internet, and I want people to use it. So I'm going to go over here, and I've already deployed it previously. I'm going to redeploy it just to give you a sense of how this works. So I'm going to go to web service, and you can see all the repos. I'm going to do render this one, the TypeScript router test. So I'm going to name my ID. I'm going to do render ts test. I think that's name. Okay, so I'll just do 1, 2, 3. Here, okay, so the thing you need to know is that render is not a pure server in the way that you might expect with like GCP's compute platform or AWS EC2 or I don't really know AWS, so I won't speak on it. But the point is, you do need to be able to comply with one of these platform environments. So I'm using Go, but I mean, if you're doing something more custom, you can still use Docker, so that's not off the table. I'm going to use I'm going to use Node, and my region. So, okay, so the thing is, render.com is technically a provider, but they're using AWS and GCP behind the scenes. And I believe, I don't know which one it is, I think Oregon's in the States and maybe Germany is, Oregon's obviously in the States. I think Oregon's provided by GCP and Germany by AWS or vice versa. But the point is, render.com is basically like a front end for GCP and or AWS depending on the region. So the thing is, right, this is not a lot of regions. And why is that? Well, render.com is only like, I think 2 years old, as 2019 is, I think, when they sort of started making headlines. And just to give you an idea, the founder, I don't know his name off the top, but I know that he has been with Stripe for years. And so his mission is basically to provide a developer-centric experience for deploying to the web, which is a little bit similar to sort of what Stripe is trying to do, right? They're trying to create a developer-centric way to accept payments on the web. So a lot of that sort of design philosophy I think has bled through on render.com, and I personally appreciate that a lot. So I'm going to deploy the master branch, and I should mention, right, this code that I've got over here, it's already on GitHub, right? So it's been initialized as a Git repo, it's on GitHub. Cool. So I'm using yarn, it could be npm, it doesn't really matter. What I do need to do is get this project to get esbuild. I could probably just deploy the pre-built, not binary, but bundled file. But to kind of keep things more stateless and pure, I'm going to go ahead and just rely on yarn here. I'm going to do yarn, and that's going to initialize it. And then I've got my make command. And so yarn is going to install sbuild for me, whereas make will, where is it, right over here? Make is actually going to build this bundled file. And so now that I have this, I should be able to deploy it. And what is the deploy command? It's going to be, right, it's going to be node main.sbuild.js. And so this is just a node server, basically. Okay, so pricing, let's talk about that real quick. Depending on how you use render.com, it could become expensive if you're not careful. And the reason is, if you were to deploy to GCP, you've got the whole server. You can do whatever you want with it. If I'm not mistaken, render.com, it's a little bit more like you have a server per repo. And depending on if you want to deploy a lot of repos, that potentially could get expensive, especially because I don't know if you can sort of put multiple repos together on the same server. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but the way they've sort of designed it ergonomically is that it's sort of one repo, one server. And that has its benefits and drawbacks, the benefits being that it's really simple, but the drawbacks are that you can't necessarily sort of, I don't know, unless you got like this sort of massive mono repo situation, it could get pricey because you have to, deploy a lot of little servers. But what I will say is that on render, you can actually suspend your service. And so this is like on GCP. If you don't want to get charged because you've already, prototyped an idea, it's working, and you don't really want to delete it, you can suspend the service. And by suspending it, you're not going to incur fees, right? There's no, you can play with something for like 5 minutes, suspend it, and validate your idea. And that's great because you get the user interface benefits of render.com, but you do get that sort of pausability that you would get with like GCP. Now, just to compare this with DigitalOcean, because I've been doing some research, talking to some friends, DigitalOcean has an app platform, but I don't think I could be wrong, but I don't think you can actually pause the services that you deploy. And what that means is they basically want you to pay them forever or delete your service, and neither one of those is sort of ideal. So render.com, they sort of hit the sweet spot here. So I'm going to go to the advanced options, and if you're like me, maybe you don't want to auto-deploy on every Git commit, maybe you want to do that manually, totally up to you. I haven't played with this, so I won't talk about it. Okay, so environmental variables. Technically, in our program, if I go back to here and I look at main.ts, the only environmental variable that I'm using is processenv port. Right, so if I want to customize the port, I can do that, and I can customize it if I want to. But because I have a fallback, this is actually not necessary. It'll fall back to 8000 by default. I'm going to delete that, and I'm assuming that we're good here. Looks good. Okay, let's try to deploy this. So I'm going to, okay, so a couple things to take a look at. The URL right here is associated with this build process getting set up. So if I navigate around here, it's going to change the URL. But if I want to get back to where I was, because if I look at the logs, this is empty right now. What I really want to see are the logs for the deploy. And so I can click that, and you can see that returns us to the original URL. So if I look at the output, this is nice, by the way. It's like a small quality of life thing. They actually print timestamps for you, so you don't have to bother with printing timestamps in your own code. You can just put the info that you care about. So anyway, it's going to initialize yarn because I've specified to use yarn. It's going to run the make command like we talked about. It's done in 3 milliseconds. It's uploading. It's deploying. And any second now, this will change, and we'll be able to try our little service on the web. The other thing that I want to mention is if you wanted to change the URL, so you can customize this to be api.whatever or just your business URL, you can do that. I haven't done it before, but I know that that's within the realm of how you can actually use render.com. Yeah, custom domains right here. So I haven't done it, but yeah, they support it. So anyway, so the deploy is now live. If I look at the logs, I should see, here we go. So we're live. And right, so this ready on port whatever that is. I guess it's not 8,000, but so be it. That's coming from here. So now we know our program is running, right? And so if I click this, so, okay, that's actually supposed to happen because if I go over to here, we don't actually have an entry point for, like, you know, the slash, but we do have A, B, C, and this little hello world regex. So I'm just going to go ahead and poke around. I'm going to do /A, /B, hello world. I'm going to do hello world with an O because we can. The point is, that's working. This is deployed with HTTPS. That means I don't have to worry about certificates or even necessarily know what they are. And because I've set up logging in my actual router implementation, right over, where's that? Router TS. I put some little start end functions, and those will just do console log and start a timer. I can sort of see in real time, this is getting streamed over WebSockets or server-side events, you know, what's happening. And this is great because doing this, I mean, it's not that you can't do this, you obviously can with GCP, AWS, maybe DigitalOcean, but, you know, that took seconds. And, you know, if I want to redeploy manually or just pull in a Git commit, like, all this is trivial now. And that means that you can spend more time on, like, the thing that you actually care about and not really on this plumbing that, you know, may be essential, but it is getting abstracted away from you. So this is really cool, right? Like, it's working. You can also, I think that, yeah, they have some metrics to see, you know, how well does your server scale, you know, when it's being used. So anyway, I've just had a really great experience with this, and, you know, it's really encouraging. And so I'm going to go ahead and suspend the service. I'm not going to delete it. But by doing so, we're not going to get billed for activity from now on. And if I go to the billing, you can see I've got, you know, just a bunch of little experiments. So they're going to estimate charges for you, but that's only if you keep services active. And so right now I do have one service active, this one, and so I will be, you know, billed for that. But for everything else, you know, it's essentially free if you just want to play around for 5 minutes, and the servers aren't expensive in the first place. So anyway, you know, this is not, it's not an endorsement in the sense that they're like, no one has, you know, encouraged me to make this video except for me, but I'm showing you because I'm genuinely, you know, excited and enthusiastic about this because this really changes the equation. In terms of getting your ideas out, you know, validating them, not worrying about, you know, deployment and infrastructure. So, it's, you know, it's a good time to be alive, especially if you're a solo developer or you're just sort of learning the stuff for the first time. So I hope that was cool and informative. If you want to look at the source code for this, I believe it's online. I'll link that in the description. If you have comments or whatever, feel free to hit me up. But yeah, so this is my first of, you know, cool tips and techniques, and I hope that it's valuable to you. Okay, see you next time.